Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for week 14, focusing on faithful living in community, ethical exhortations and the sacrifice of praise, Hebrews 13 verses 1 to 17, Luke Timothy Johnson, Hebrews, a commentary, Louisville, Westminster John Knox Press, 2006, 336 to 350. Welcome to our seminar. Today we explore the profound transition from endurance to faith, focusing on the context of Hebrews chapter 11. As we lay the groundwork, consider this essential statement from our text. The author notes that Hebrews agrees with the Septuagint manuscripts in which might modifies the righteous one, making the phrase, "My righteous one will live out of faith." This linguistic choice is not merely academic, it forms the theological backbone of the entire chapter. Imagine an architect laying the cornerstone of a massive cathedral. The writer of Hebrews is doing exactly that with the concept of faith, setting up a metronomic rhythm that will carry us through Israel's history. The term righteous appears here to establish a direct link between faithful endurance and ultimate salvation. The text further elaborates on the final sentence of Habakkuk, explaining that it challenges the translator because of its compressed expression, utilizing terms like drawing back and of faith. What does it mean to draw back? In the context of a community facing the expropriation of their material property, drawing back is a temptation born of fear. It is the very opposite of the faith required to preserve one's soul. The author is contrasting the destruction that follows apostasy with the saving of life that results from enduring faith. Let us look at another key observation. The commentary states that the long encomium on faith that seems to begin in chapter 11 verse 1 actually builds on the theme of endurance and faith stated in chapter 10. This implies that chapter 11 is not a standalone hall of fame. It is an intricate tapestry woven directly into the immediate exhortation to hold fast. Think of it as a compelling legal argument in a high-stakes trial. The author has just warned the congregation about the dangers of shrinking back, and now he summons a cloud of historical witnesses to prove that faith is the only viable path forward. The heroes we are about to meet are not superheroes with unattainable powers, they are ordinary individuals who chose to trust the invisible God in the face of visible threats. By bridging the past and the present, the author provides a positive incentive for the hearers to endure their own difficulties. They are summoned to become imitators of those who, through faith and patience, inherit the promises. The lexical complexity of faith, particularly the terms hypostasis and elenkos in Hebrews 11 verse 1, presents a fascinating study. We often recite, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen." But the author's word choices leave translators in a considerable quandary. When we encounter the word hypostasis, we are digging into the very bedrock of Christian assurance. In ancient papyri, this word was frequently used to describe a title deed to a property. Imagine a community violently stripped of their worldly possessions, the author profoundly tells them that their faith is the actual title deed to an invisible, imperishable reality. It is a down payment or pledge that allows believers to participate in future realities right now. It means that the future is bleeding into the present through their trust in God. Furthermore, we must carefully consider the second term, elenkos. The commentary highlights that elenkos is used in the sense of a proof or demonstration, arguing that faith acts on unseen things as though they were capable of being seen. Why do believers act this way? Because these unseen realities are understood to be as real, or even more real, than things that can be verified by the physical senses. This is not a description of blind optimism or wishful thinking. It is a robust, evidentiary conviction. The believer's life becomes the physical, walking demonstration of an invisible kingdom. When we live out our faith in the face of suffering, our actions serve as a compelling cross-examination of the world's materialistic assumptions, proving that God's invisible promises hold ultimate authority. The epistemology of the unseen, focusing on the ages fashioned by the Word of God, requires us to shift our entire paradigm of reality. Let us dissect the mechanics of how faith operates. The text notes that the statement is to explain how faith is substance and proof, because the ancients were by this attested. Notice the passive voice used in the Greek text here. It is God who is doing the attesting. Faith is not merely an independent human achievement, it is a dynamic divine interaction. When we exhibit faith, God Himself stands as the supreme witness to our disposition, validating our trust. But what exactly does faith empower us to understand? The commentary states that faith involves a kind of knowledge, not merely simple knowing, but suggesting also a certain grasp or insight. Through faith, we understand that the ages were fashioned by God's word. This specific verb for fashioned implies arranging or putting into order. It means that human history is not a series of random, chaotic accidents but a sequence meticulously arranged by the divine word. This radically alters how we view our existence. The text continues, declaring that faith's understanding that the universe is fashioned by the word of God changes the human perception of all things, so that what we see comes from what we do not see. This is the profound, foundational difference between a believer and an atheist. The visible, sensory world is not self-contained, self-derived, or self-sufficient. It is entirely dependent on an invisible, eternal power. When the early Christian community faced severe persecution, this epistemology became their anchor. They were not merely losing earthly goods, they were recognizing the transient nature of the visible world while gripping tightly to the invisible, eternal reality that brought everything into existence. Let us now turn our attention to the primordial witnesses, Abel and Enoch, who stand as powerful testaments to righteousness and divine reward. We begin with the tragic yet beautiful story of Abel. The commentary explains that Abel offered to God a greater sacrifice than did Cain, and while the Genesis account does not explicitly state it was greater, its details allow such an inference. In the ancient system of values, the firstborn of the flock was considered infinitely more valuable than the fruits of the soil. Abel offered the absolute best of what he had, demonstrating an acute awareness of the supremacy of the invisible God. This offering was a tangible, costly expression of his faith. The text further observes that God's testifying over his gifts is taken as a witness to the fact that Abel was a righteous one. The author of Hebrews connects faith inextricably with righteousness, they are two sides of the same spiritual coin. But Abel's story does not end with his tragic death. As the commentary beautifully points out, through his faith, although he died, he continues to speak. Imagine the blood of Abel crying out from the ground, not just pleading for justice, but acting as a perpetual, echoing testimony to enduring faith. He anticipates the ultimate resurrection, proving that the righteous one truly lives by faith. Transitioning to Enoch, we see another profound dimension of this spiritual reality. The text states that Enoch was taken away so that he would not see death, and that it was his disposition of faith during his life that leads to God's gift of continuing life. Enoch pleased God, and the author draws a definitive theological conclusion from this ancient narrative. The one approaching God must believe that he exists and that he is the rewarder of those who seek him. True faith requires an active pursuit of God, recognizing him not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a personal creator who intimately rewards those who passionately seek his presence. Next, we examine Noah's reverence, an exemplary display of obedient faith concerning things not yet seen. The story of Noah and the Great Flood is universally recognized, but Hebrews extracts a very specific, incisive theological principle from it. The commentary notes that Noah built an ark to save his household, out of reverence, when he was warned about things not yet seen. Stop and think about the sheer magnitude of this faith. Noah had absolutely no empirical evidence of a global flood. There was no historical precedent for the cataclysmic event God described. Yet, driven by holy fear and deep spiritual reverence, Noah committed decades of his life and resources to building the ark. This aligns perfectly with the author's opening definition of faith as the proof of things not seen. Noah's monumental actions rendered the invisible judgment of God a highly visible reality in his generation. The text further emphasizes that the interpretation in Hebrews focuses primarily on Noah's response to God, calling him an heir of the righteousness that is according to faith. Noah did not merely survive a natural disaster, he inherited the very promises of God through his unwavering obedience. By taking God completely at his word, Noah implicitly condemned the unbelieving, corrupt world around him. His life serves as a stark, historical reminder that true faith inevitably results in concrete obedience, especially when that obedience seems irrational or foolish to the surrounding culture. Noah's faith was not passive intellectual assent, it was the laborious, relentless construction of a massive vessel, driven entirely by an unyielding trust in the divine warning. Let us transition to the patriarchs, beginning with Abraham's remarkable pilgrimage toward the divine architect. Abraham occupies a central, foundational place in the architecture of Hebrews chapter 11. The text highlights a terrifying moment of trust, stating that Abraham, when he was called, obeyed, and he departed without knowing where he was going. Consider the profound vulnerability of this act. In the ancient Near East, your identity, physical security, and economic prosperity were intrinsically tied to your ancestral land and your kindred. Yet, Abraham relinquishes all visible security for an entirely invisible promise. This is the absolute epitome of acting on faith. The commentary elaborates on his subsequent life, noting that he sojourned in the land of promise as if it were foreign. This highlights the stark contrast between the inherently unstable condition of living in tents, as opposed to dwelling in a city having foundations. Abraham physically lived in the promised land of Canaan, but he lived there as a temporary resident, a nomad in a fragile tent. Why did he embrace this instability? Because his ultimate hope was not in terrestrial real estate or geopolitical power. The text powerfully points out that the solid city they expect is one whose designer and maker is God. Abraham realized that no human city, no matter how gloriously constructed, could satisfy the eternal longing of his soul. He was looking for the heavenly Jerusalem. The commentary notes that this bold interpretation makes the structure and goal of the patriarch's faith exactly the same as that of the Christian believers. The persecuted audience of Hebrews, who are currently losing their earthly homes, are fundamentally on the exact same pilgrimage as Father Abraham. They too are seeking the eternal city, flawlessly constructed by the hands of God Himself. Our journey brings us to the profound faith of Sarah, who embraced the faithful promiser amidst the deadness of her own body. This is a crucial, miraculous moment in the narrative of redemptive history. The text brings Sarah into sharp, theological focus, stating that by faith, even Sarah herself, being sterile, received a capacity for the planting of a seed, because she considered the one who had made the promise to be faithful. Translating this verse presents fascinating challenges, as ancient medical terminology often attributed the active role in conception solely to the male. However, the author of Hebrews beautifully elevates Sarah's agency. The commentary insightfully argues that while the phrase, casting a seed, is ordinarily used for the male role, Sarah receives the power for it to happen, and her faith enables the one man to have so many descendants. Sarah's biological reality was a firmly closed door. She was historically barren and well past the natural age of childbearing. Yet, her faith served as the vital conduit for divine, life-giving power. The commentary draws a breathtaking theological parallel, noting that Sarah's faith shows how God can bring life from death, and therefore anticipates the resurrection of Jesus. From a biological state that the text graphically describes as nearly dead, an innumerable multitude of descendants was born. Sarah looked entirely past the physical impossibilities and anchored her trust in the absolute, unbending fidelity of God. For the original readers, and for us today, Sarah stands as a towering monument to the truth that God's promises are never constrained by human limitations, failing bodies, or seemingly hopeless circumstances. Reflecting on the overarching patriarchal narrative, we arrive at the Pilgrim Confession, where these heroes vividly acknowledge themselves as strangers seeking a heavenly homeland. This summary statement is one of the most poignant and pastorally sensitive sections in the entire epistle. The commentary reflects on this reality, noting that these all died according to faith, not having received the promises, but having greeted them from afar, and confessed that they were strangers and aliens on the land. They lived their entire, lengthy lives in the agonizing tension of the already and the not yet. They possessed the divine promise, but they did not live to see its ultimate materialization. Yet, their response was not bitterness or cynicism, but a profound public confession. Their speech, the commentary notes, makes clear that they are seeking a homeland. If their ultimate desire had been their geographical origins in Mesopotamia, they could have easily returned. But they adamantly refused to go backward. The text explains that they desire a better, that is, a heavenly homeland, and consequently, God is not ashamed to be called their God. In the dominant honor and shame culture of the ancient Mediterranean world, this is a staggering statement. Because these patriarchs honored God by trusting Him above all earthly comfort and logic, the Creator of the universe considers it an immense honor to be publicly associated with them. The commentary emphasizes that God has prepared a city for them. Their faith was not a psychological coping mechanism to deal with a nomadic life, it was a carefully calibrated response to an objective, eternal reality being meticulously prepared by God in the heavens. We now encounter the ultimate test of faith in the Akedah, and the eschatological blessings pronounced by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. The narrative of Abraham offering Isaac is undeniably the pinnacle of the patriarch's faith journey. The commentary states that by faith, when Abraham was tested, he sacrificed Isaac, and he considered that God was powerful enough even to raise the dead. Let us grasp the immense weight of this moment. God had explicitly declared that it was through Isaac that the eternal covenant promises would be fulfilled. To sacrifice Isaac was, from any logical human perspective, to assassinate the promise itself. Yet, Abraham's faith had matured to such a spectacular degree that he reconciled the contradictory commands of God through a profound belief in resurrection. The text notes that because Abraham acted in faith, in symbolic fashion, he received him back. This figurative resurrection from the altar points directly and unequivocally to the ultimate resurrection of Jesus Christ. Following Abraham's supreme example, we see this relentlessly future-oriented faith passed down the generational lines. The commentary explains that Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph each defined their faith in terms of an action taken in the present time with a view toward a future realization. Whether it was Isaac blessing his sons concerning things to come, Jacob worshipping over his staff as his body failed, or Joseph commanding that his bones be carried in the future exodus hundreds of years later, each man looked far beyond his own mortality. Their physical bodies were deteriorating, but their spiritual vision was piercing the veil of time, resting entirely on the unbreakable faithfulness of God to His covenant people. Finally, we focus our attention on the faith of Moses, examining his defiance of empire and his incredible embrace of the reproach of the Messiah. Moses is a towering historical figure, and Hebrews casts his early life as a masterclass in faithful, subversive endurance. The commentary points out that by faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's wrath, for he endured as though seeing the one who is invisible. Moses grew up in the absolute epicenter of ancient power, completely surrounded by the wealth, military might, and prestige of Pharaoh's court. Yet, he made a calculated, radical choice to walk away from it all. The text states that he chose rather to suffer hardship with God's people than to have the temporary advantage from sin, considering the reproach of the Messiah as greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt. This is a staggering historical and theological overlay by the author of Hebrews. Moses' solidarity with the suffering, marginalized Israelites is explicitly identified as bearing the reproach of the Messiah, centuries before Jesus was even born. He valued the invisible, eternal reward far above the visible, temporary treasures of the greatest empire on earth. The commentary insightfully concludes that faith demands fearing God rather than human rulers. For the original audience of Hebrews, who were facing systemic marginalization and potential violence from the Roman Empire, Moses serves as the ultimate paradigm. He teaches us that true faith requires a complete reevaluation of what constitutes true wealth and true power. We are called to align ourselves with the suffering people of God, keeping our eyes fixed unwaveringly on the invisible God. As we draw this academic session to a close, we turn to the collective faith of the Israelites and the astonishing, paradigm-shifting inclusion of Rahab. The journey from Egypt to the borders of the Promised Land is marked by extraordinary moments of divine deliverance, all activated by human faith. The commentary notes that the Israelites acted by faith when they crossed the Red Sea and when they circled the walls of Jericho. These were obviously not conventional military victories achieved through superior strategy, weaponry, or human strength. crossing a roaring sea on dry ground and bringing down heavily fortified, impenetrable city walls by merely marching around them are acts of absolute reliance on the invisible power of God. The people had to trust the divine command implicitly, even when it defied all conventional military logic. Furthermore, the narrative takes a profoundly beautiful turn by highlighting a marginalized, scandalous figure. The text emphasizes that it is by faith that Rahab the harlot, the second woman explicitly to be named in this honor roll, received the Israelite scouts in peace. Rahab was a Canaanite, a foreigner to the covenants, and a woman of ill repute. Yet, her spiritual vision vastly surpassed that of her own powerful king. She clearly recognized the supremacy of Israel's God and acted upon that conviction at the extreme risk of her own life. Her inclusion in this illustrious list demonstrates that the community of faith is not bound by ethnicity, gender, or past moral failures. It is defined solely by a courageous, obedient trust in the living God. Rahab's story powerfully underscores that God's grace and the call to faithful living extend to the absolute margins of society, welcoming all who dare to believe. Part 2, Main Analysis, The Foundational Nature of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for. When we approach this majestic opening of chapter 11, we are stepping into one of the most profound theological statements in the New Testament. The author uses a specific Greek word here, hypostasis, which is translated as substance. In the ancient world, hypostasis was not merely a psychological feeling of confidence. It was a concrete term used in business and philosophy. It could refer to a property title deed or a guarantee of ownership. Imagine you purchase a beautiful estate, but you have not yet moved in. You hold the title deed in your hands. That piece of paper is the objective reality of your future home. In the same way, faith is the down payment, the objective pledge that makes our future realities actually present in our lives right now. For the original audience of Hebrews, who were facing persecution and the loss of their earthly possessions, this meant that their faith was their most valuable asset. It was the guarantee of a permanent, heavenly inheritance that no earthly power could take away. A proof of things not seen. Here, the author introduces another critical Greek term, elenkos, which means proof or demonstration. This tells us that faith is active, not passive. It is the visible demonstration of an invisible reality. When a believer chooses to endure hardship rather than compromise their values, that endurance becomes a tangible proof to the world that God exists and that His promises are true. Faith acts upon the unseen world as if it were completely visible and verifiable by our physical senses. This is the profound epistemology of Hebrews. We do not just believe in spite of a lack of evidence, our faith itself becomes the evidence. By living out this deeply rooted trust, we bring the reality of God's future kingdom into our present circumstances. This foundational definition sets the stage for the magnificent roll call of heroes that follows, showing us that true faith is always an active participation in the unseen realities of God. Part 2, Main Analysis, Faith as Epistemology and Creation, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. For by this, the ancients were attested. The author immediately connects his definition of faith to the historical reality of the Israelite people. He is telling his audience that this powerful, substance-giving faith is not a new invention. It is the very foundation upon which all the great heroes of the past built their lives. The term attested here carries a legal or forensic overtone. It means that God Himself served as the ultimate witness to their lives. God looked at their enduring trust and testified on their behalf, declaring them righteous. This links perfectly with the quotation from Habakkuk in the previous chapter, reminding us that the righteous will live by their faith. By faith, we understand that the ages were fashioned by God's word, so that what we see comes from what we do not see. This is a breathtaking philosophical and theological claim. The author tells us that faith is actually a way of knowing, a divine epistemology. The Greek word for understand implies a deep, perceptive insight into the nature of reality. Through faith, we recognize that the entire universe, described here as the ages, was not a random accident. It was meticulously crafted and ordered by the spoken word of God. This challenges any worldview that claims the physical universe is self-contained or self-sufficient. Instead, faith perceives that everything we can touch, see, and measure ultimately originates from an invisible, transcendent source. The sensory world is dependent upon the unseen power of God. This means that when we live by faith, we are actually living in accordance with the truest reality of the universe. We are looking past the temporary, visible structures of this world and anchoring our lives in the eternal, invisible power that created everything out of nothing. This understanding transforms how we view our daily struggles, reminding us that the unseen God is the ultimate architect of our destiny. Part 2, Main Analysis, Abel's Righteousness and Enduring Voice, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a greater sacrifice than did Cain. As we dive into the specific examples of faith, the author begins at the very dawn of human history with the story of Abel. You might wonder, what exactly made Abel's sacrifice greater than his brother's? If we look closely at the ancient Genesis account, we see that Cain simply brought some standard fruits of the soil, but Abel purposefully brought the absolute firstborn of his flock and their best fat portions. In the ancient world, offering the firstborn animals demonstrated a profound reverence and recognition that the absolute best belongs to God. Abel's faith was an active perception of a power far greater than the visible world, a God who is worthy of the highest possible honor. Through it, he was attested as righteous, since God himself testified over his gifts. And through it, although he died, he continues to speak. Here we see the deep, unbreakable connection between faith and righteousness. God himself becomes the ultimate witness to Abel's character, accepting his offering as a pure reflection of his faithful heart. But the most stunning part of this verse is the divine revelation that Abel's voice continues to speak, even long after his tragic murder. The Greek verb used here is in the present continuous tense. This means his testimony is not just a dusty relic of the past, it is an active, living voice that reverberates through all of human history. To the original persecuted audience, this was a powerfully comforting message. It suggested that death is not the final chapter for those who walk in faith. In a very real sense, Abel anticipates the glorious concept of resurrection. His continuing voice serves as a prophetic foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, whose own blood will speak a far better word of grace, forgiveness, and eternal redemption. Abel teaches us that a life lived by faith creates a legacy that even the grave cannot silence. Part 2, Main Analysis, Enoch's Ascent and the Requirements of Faith, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he would not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him away. Moving smoothly from Abel, the author turns his attention to the mysterious and fascinating figure of Enoch. In the original book of Genesis, Enoch's story is incredibly brief, simply stating that he walked with God and then was no more. However, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which the author of Hebrews utilized extensively, specifically says that Enoch pleased God. Hebrews boldly expands on this textual detail, explaining that it was precisely by faith that Enoch was taken away, entirely bypassing the agonizing experience of death. God's miraculous action of taking Enoch directly into heaven was a deliberate, divine reward for his faithful disposition during his earthly life. Enoch becomes a living, breathing demonstration that God honors those who dedicate their lives to pleasing him. And apart from faith it is impossible to please, for the one approaching God must believe that he exists and that he is the rewarder of those who seek him. This verse offers the most fundamental and uncompromising definition of what is required to have a genuine relationship with God. The author uses the beautiful phrase, approaching God, which originally carries rich imagery from the physical temple worship, but here it is elevated entirely to describe our moral and spiritual intimacy with the Creator. To draw near to God, two unshakable convictions are absolutely necessary. First, you must believe that God actually exists. This isn't just a casual mental nod to a higher power, it is the deep realization that the invisible God is the ultimate source of all reality, far more real than the physical world around us. Second, you must believe that God actively rewards those who seek him. Faith recognizes that God is not a distant, passive observer, but a loving, engaged creator who intimately involves himself in the lives of his people. God's ultimate reward is the eternal gift of his own presence. When we live with this dual conviction, our lives become a continuous, joyful journey of approaching the throne of grace. Part 2, Main Analysis, Noah's Reverence and Cosmic Judgment, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah built an ark to save his household, out of reverence, when he was warned about things not yet seen. The dramatic story of Noah perfectly illustrates the author's opening definition of faith as the definitive proof of things not seen. Imagine being in Noah's position for a moment. The sky is perfectly clear, there is absolutely no sign of impending doom, yet God speaks a chilling warning of a catastrophic global flood. Noah's faith was not just a quiet, intellectual agreement in the privacy of his own mind, it demanded decades of backbreaking, public labor to construct a massive wooden vessel on dry land. The text specifically tells us he acted out of reverence. This means he possessed a deep, holy fear and ultimate respect for God's spoken word, valuing the invisible warning far above the visible evidence of his daily, comfortable surroundings. His faithful obedience was an incredibly practical action that resulted in the physical salvation of his entire family. Through this, he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness that is according to faith. Noah's staggering act of faith served a profound dual purpose. On one hand, his highly visible obedience stood as a silent, powerful condemnation of a deeply corrupt and faithless generation. Every swing of the hammer and every plank of wood was a living testimony to the reality of God's coming judgment. On the other hand, it firmly established Noah as a primary heir to the eternal promises of God. He fully inherited the righteousness that always, without exception, accompanies true faith. Hebrews elevates Noah from being just a lucky survivor of a tragic flood to a monumental pioneer of faith. He teaches us that true faith often requires us to build arks in our own lives, taking difficult, highly countercultural actions based solely on the promises and warnings of God. When we trust God for the unseen future, our lives become a beacon of absolute truth in a dark world. Part 2, Main Analysis, Abraham's Obedient Pilgrimage, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by departing to a place that he would receive as an inheritance, and he departed without knowing where he was going. We now arrive at Abraham, the undisputed giant of the Old Testament, who rightfully occupies the largest section of this chapter. His epic journey begins with a radical, life-altering call to leave absolutely everything familiar behind. Abraham's faith is vividly characterized by absolute, unquestioning obedience. He stepped out of his secure homeland without a map, without a guaranteed itinerary, and without knowing his final destination. This is the ultimate, breathtaking expression of faith acting as the substance of things hoped for. He trusted the invisible caller infinitely more than the visible security of his hometown. His journey was not a random wandering, it was a highly purposeful pilgrimage driven entirely by a divine promise. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise as if it were foreign. He dwelt in tents with the fellow heirs to the same promise. Even when Abraham finally arrived in the very land God had promised him, he did not build a permanent stone fortress. Instead, he lived in fragile, temporary tents alongside his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob. He lived intentionally as an alien in the very place he was destined to inherit. Why would a wealthy patriarch do this? For he was expecting the city that has foundations, whose designer and maker is God. Abraham's spiritual vision brilliantly pierced through the physical reality of the land of Canaan. He realized deep in his soul that no earthly geography could truly fulfill the immense depth of God's promise. He was looking continuously forward to a heavenly city, a permanent dwelling place designed and perfectly constructed by God Himself. This completely reframes the Christian life. Like Abraham, we are called to live as spiritual pilgrims. We may enjoy the blessings of this earth, but we must never pitch our tents permanently here, relying instead on the unseen promises of God. Part 2, Main Analysis, Sarah's Faith and the Miracle of Life, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. By faith, even Sarah herself, being sterile, received a capacity for the planting of a seed, even though she was past the age. The biblical narrative now shifts to Sarah, addressing one of the most profound and impossible miracles in the entire Genesis story. While many ancient texts often focused solely on the male role in generating life, the author of Hebrews beautifully elevates Sarah's active, dynamic faith. She was not just a passive vessel waiting for things to happen, her own deep trust in God was the essential catalyst for the miracle. From a purely biological and medical perspective, the situation was utterly, completely hopeless. Sarah was sterile her entire life, and she was now well past the natural age for bearing children. Her body was essentially dead to the possibility of producing life. Yet, in the absolute face of this biological impossibility, she received a divine, supernatural capacity to conceive. Why did this happen? Because she considered the one who had made the promise to be faithful. Her faith was anchored not in her own failing physical abilities, but in the unshakable, perfect character of God. She recognized that the God who spoke the vast universe into existence could easily speak life into her barren womb. Therefore also there were born from one man, and him indeed nearly dead, descendants as many as the stars in the sky. Because of Sarah's incredible faith, Abraham, who was also physically past his prime and nearly dead in a reproductive sense, became the father of a massive multitude. Out of utter deadness, God miraculously brought forth life as numerous as the stars and as countless as the sand on the seashore. This is a spectacular, historical preview of the resurrection power of God. It reminds us powerfully that God specializes in bringing abundant life out of death, and brilliant hope out of deep despair. When we, exactly like Sarah, consider God completely faithful to his promises, we open our lives to his miraculous power. Part 2, Main Analysis, the Patriarchal Confession, Strangers and Aliens, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. These all died according to faith. They did not receive the promises. But seeing from a distance, they both greeted them and confessed that they were strangers and aliens on the land. The author temporarily pauses the historical narrative to offer a profoundly deep theological reflection on the lives of the patriarchs. He notes a striking, almost heartbreaking paradox. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived their entire lives faithfully, yet they died without ever seeing the full, physical realization of God's promises. They never possessed the land fully, and their descendants were not yet a great nation. But instead of despairing or becoming bitter, they saw the beautiful fulfillment from a distance and joyfully greeted it. They publicly and unashamedly confessed that they were mere strangers and temporary aliens on the earth. This confession is immensely powerful. It means they stubbornly refused to find their ultimate identity, value, and security in the temporary comforts of this visible world. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly, one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. If their true home had been the earthly place they left behind in Mesopotamia, they could have easily returned whenever things got difficult. Instead, they continually stretched forward, desiring a far superior, heavenly homeland. Because they honored God by trusting completely in his invisible, eternal kingdom, God in turn highly honors them. The text says God is not ashamed to be called their God. In the ancient world, which operated strictly on honor and shame, this is the highest compliment imaginable. The Creator of the universe proudly associates his own holy name with these faithful wanderers. And he has personally, meticulously prepared an eternal city for them. When we live as faithful pilgrims, seeking God's eternal home rather than earthly kingdoms, we bring immense honor to God, and he proudly claims us as his own beloved children. Part 2, Main Analysis, the Akedah and Abraham's Ultimate Test, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 17 through 19. By faith, when Abraham was tested, he sacrificed Isaac, and the one who had received the promises began to offer up his only son. We now confront the most agonizing, dramatic, and emotionally devastating moment in Abraham's entire life, an event known in ancient Jewish tradition as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. God commanded Abraham to sacrifice the very son through whom all the divine promises were supposed to be fulfilled. This was the ultimate, mind-bending test of faith. Abraham was asked to surrender what was most precious to his heart, the physical embodiment of his entire future. Yet, Hebrews tells us that Abraham acted resolutely by faith. He didn't hesitate, he didn't argue, and he didn't try to negotiate, he proceeded directly to the altar. The emotional cost of this obedience was unfathomable, yet it demonstrates that true faith prioritizes the Creator above the absolute greatest of his gifts. He considered that God was powerful enough even to raise the dead. So also, in symbolic fashion, he received him back. How on earth could Abraham obey such a devastating, seemingly contradictory command? The author brilliantly reveals Abraham's faith-filled, theological logic. Abraham reasoned that if God had miraculously brought Isaac out of a dead womb in the first place, then God was entirely capable of raising Isaac from the literal ashes of the altar. Abraham's faith stretched far beyond the final boundaries of death itself. He trusted the giver of life infinitely more than the terrifying circumstances of death. Because of this radical, unflinching trust, God stopped the sacrifice at the last second, and Abraham received Isaac back. The author calls this a symbol, or a parable. In a figurative sense, Isaac experienced a real resurrection. For us as Christians, this entire event serves as a breathtaking, historical preview of the ultimate sacrifice, where God the Father offered his own Son, Jesus Christ, and subsequently raised him from the dead in ultimate victory. Part 2, Main Analysis, Transmitting the Promise, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 20 through 22. By faith also, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come. By faith, Jacob blessed each of the sons of Joseph as he was dying, and bowed over the head of his staff. As the biblical narrative flows forward, we see clearly how authentic faith operates beautifully across multiple generations. The great patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, demonstrated their deep faith by pronouncing powerful, prophetic blessings over their children and grandchildren. These weren't just sentimental well-wishes or hopeful thoughts, they were authoritative declarations anchored entirely in the unseen future that God had firmly promised. Even as Jacob's physical strength failed him on his deathbed, he summoned the spiritual strength to bless Joseph's sons, bowing in humble worship over the head of his staff. His failing, dying body did not for a single second diminish his absolute, unshakable confidence in God's eternal plan. He worshipped God to the very end, successfully passing the torch of faith to the next generation. By faith, as he was coming to an end, Joseph remembered the exodus of the children of Israel and gave commands concerning his bones. Joseph's final act on earth is a magnificent masterpiece of faithful memory and forward-looking hope. Though he was the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, luxury, and political influence, his heart was never tied to the Egyptian empire. As he faced his own death, he remembered the ancient promise God had made to Abraham, that his people would one day be miraculously delivered and return to the promised land. By giving strict instructions to carry his bones out of Egypt during the future exodus, Joseph proved that his ultimate allegiance was to God's invisible kingdom. He didn't want his remains resting in a pagan empire, he wanted to participate in the promised future. A mature faith looks beyond our own lifetimes, passionately investing in the spiritual future. Part 2, Main Analysis, Defiance by Faith and Moses' Choice, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 26. By faith, when Moses was born he was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they did not fear the king's decree. The author now introduces Moses, another absolutely monumental figure in Israel's history. But interestingly, the story begins with the incredible faith of his parents. The powerful Pharaoh of Egypt had ordered the brutal execution of all Hebrew baby boys. Yet, Moses' parents looked at their infant son, recognized God's special, divine favor upon him, and flatly defied the most powerful ruler on the face of the earth. Their supreme faith in God completely eclipsed their natural fear of human authority. This early, dangerous act of rebellion set the perfect stage for Moses' own radical life choices. He chose rather to suffer hardship with God's people than to have the temporary advantage from sin. He considered the reproach of the Messiah as greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. When Moses grew up, he was living comfortably as a prince in the royal courts of Egypt, possessing unrestricted access to unlimited wealth, military power, and cultural prestige. But by faith, he walked away from all of it. He intentionally and painfully identified himself with an enslaved, oppressed, and despised people. Why? Because he recognized that the fleeting pleasures of sin and worldly power were entirely worthless compared to the eternal value of God's promises. The author makes a stunning, breathtaking connection here, stating that Moses embraced the reproach of the Messiah. Moses willingly suffered the exact same kind of rejection, pain, and dishonor that Jesus Christ would later face. Moses meticulously evaluated the bank accounts of heaven and earth, and correctly calculated that suffering for God's purposes was infinitely more valuable than all the gold in Egypt. True faith often requires us to abandon worldly comfort, risk our reputations, and stand boldly with the oppressed. Part 2, Main Analysis, Endurance Through Seeing the Invisible, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 27 through 31. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's wrath, for he endured as though seeing the one who is invisible. Moses' monumental, history-altering confrontation with Pharaoh is summarized brilliantly in this single, powerful verse. He led a terrified nation of slaves out of the grip of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. How did he possibly withstand the terrifying, murderous wrath of the Pharaoh? The absolute secret to his endurance was his profound spiritual vision. Moses persevered and stood his ground because he lived as if he were looking directly into the eyes of the invisible God. When the unseen Creator becomes more real to you than the visible threats of this world, earthly fear completely loses its grip. By faith, he carried out the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. By faith, they crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish. The author dramatically accelerates the narrative pace, showcasing a rapid-fire series of miraculous deliverances. The Israelites applied the blood of the Passover lamb by faith, narrowly escaping the angel of death. They stepped into the roaring, terrifying waters of the Red Sea by faith, watching in awe as God carved a dry highway to freedom. And perhaps most surprisingly and beautifully, the author includes Rahab, a Gentile prostitute living in Jericho. She wasn't an Israelite, and she certainly didn't have a pristine moral background. But she recognized the supreme, unmatched power of Israel's God, received the spies in peace, and tied a scarlet cord in her window. Her daring faith saved her entire family from the total destruction of the city. From the great prophet Moses to the marginalized Rahab, the lesson is crystal clear. Faith is the great equalizer. Whether you are leading a nation or hiding in a doomed city, trusting in the invisible God and obeying His commands is the only path to true salvation. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Epistemological Foundations of Faith. Welcome to the concluding segment of our profound journey through this text. As we gather to apply these theological truths to our community, we must first establish the absolute bedrock of our discussion. Let us hear the defining words of the author. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. This extraordinary declaration sets the stage for everything that follows. When we dive into the original language, we encounter a fascinating dilemma with the word hypostasis, which is translated here as substance. Is it merely a subjective feeling of confidence, or is it something far more concrete? Luke Timothy Johnson, in his masterful commentary, argues compellingly for an objective reading. Imagine, for a moment, that you have purchased a piece of land in a distant country. You have never seen it, you have never walked on its soil, but you hold the property title deed in your hands. That document is your hypostasis. It is the objective guarantee, the pledge, the down payment of a future reality. For the original hearers of Hebrews, many of whom had suffered the painful confiscation of their actual physical property, this concept is revolutionary. Faith itself becomes their tangible wealth, allowing them to participate in the promised future right now, amidst their present suffering. Now, let us move to the next critical phrase. For by this, the ancients were attested. Notice the subtle beauty of this passive voice. Who is doing the attesting? It is God Himself. God is the divine witness who looks upon the enduring faith of the elders of Israel and grants His supreme approval. This is not just ancient history, it is a living application for the community. When you face trials, when you are tempted to shrink back or compromise your ethical standards, remember that your steadfastness is being witnessed by the Creator of the universe. Your faith acts as an elenkos, a rigorous proof or demonstration that the unseen world is actually more real, and infinitely more durable, than the temporary hardships you can see with your physical eyes. Therefore, the ultimate conclusion we draw today is that faith is not a blind leap into the dark. Rather, it is a profoundly rational and objective grasp of the truest reality, a reality certified by God Himself. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Faith as Epistemological Reorientation. As we build upon the foundation of faith as a tangible title deed, we must explore how this faith completely transforms the way we perceive the universe. Let us turn to the next profound assertion in the text. By faith, we understand that the ages were fashioned by God's word, so that what we see comes from what we do not see. This is not just a statement about the past, it is a comprehensive lens for viewing the entirety of existence. The author uses the Greek word noen for understand, which goes beyond mere intellectual agreement. It implies a deep, inner grasp, a fundamental insight into the very nature of reality. Imagine looking at a beautiful, complex tapestry. Without faith, you only see the colored threads on the surface. But with the understanding provided by faith, you recognize the unseen hand of the master weaver who meticulously arranged every single thread. Luke Timothy Johnson points out that the author's choice of the word ages, or aions, encompasses both the spatial universe and the unfolding epochs of time. This faith-driven understanding completely reorients the community's epistemology. We realize that the material world, the realm that can be measured, touched, and often weaponized against us, is neither self-derived nor self-sufficient. Let us carefully consider the second part of the author's thought. What we see comes from what we do not see. This conviction echoes the Genesis creation account, where God brings forth entire realities by a mere spoken word. Why does this matter so deeply for our ethical application today? Because if the visible world is entirely dependent upon the invisible God, then the visible threats, the persecutions, and the systemic injustices we face are ultimately inferior to the unseen power of God. By embracing this truth, the community is empowered to live boldly and without compromise. We are no longer held hostage by the tyranny of the visible. Instead, our daily lives, our ethical choices, and our communal love become a living proof of the unseen God. We are called to embody this epistemology, allowing our actions to loudly declare that the invisible realm of God's promises is the truest reality of all. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Abel and the Enduring Voice of Righteousness. As we continue our exploration of applied faith, we encounter the profound narrative of Abel. Let us turn to the text describing his foundational act of worship. By faith, Abel offered to God a greater sacrifice than did Cain. Notice that the text focuses intensely on the quality of the sacrifice. While the Genesis account highlights that Abel offered the firstborn of his flock, Johnson points out that the ancient value system inherently prized animal offerings over the fruits of the earth. More importantly, however, this greater sacrifice reflects a deeper, unseen reality, which is the righteous disposition of Abel himself. Abel recognized that the absolute best of what is created must be offered back to the Creator, demonstrating faith's perception of a power far greater than the visible world. His offering was a tangible expression of his inner faith. This brings us to a crucial lesson for our own community's worship and ethical life. Now, let us examine the profound result of this faithful offering. Through it, he was attested as righteous, since God himself testified over his gifts. And through it, although he died, he continues to speak. The ultimate validation of Abel's life was not earthly success or longevity, for he was tragically murdered by his own brother. Rather, his validation came directly from God, who testified over his gifts. What is truly remarkable is the ongoing nature of Abel's testimony. The author uses the present tense, declaring that he continues to speak. Abel's blood crying out from the ground is transformed here into a triumphant, living voice that anticipates resurrection itself. It proves the foundational premise that the righteous one will indeed live from faith, even beyond the grave. For our community today, the application is deeply encouraging. When we offer our lives, our resources, and our praise in genuine faith, God receives it as a righteous sacrifice. Even if our faithful living leads to severe suffering or physical death, our witness does not perish. It continues to speak, echoing through the ages as a powerful testament to the unseen realities we hold dear. Therefore, let us cultivate the righteous disposition of Abel in all our communal interactions and acts of worship. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Enoch and the Cultic Approach to God. Moving forward in our concluding reflections, we turn to the mysterious and compelling figure of Enoch. Let us listen to the author's description of Enoch's ultimate reward. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he would not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him away. For he was attested before being taken away that he had pleased God. The author of Hebrews masterfully utilizes the Septuagint translation here. Where the original Hebrew text simply states that Enoch walked with God, the Greek translation explicitly interprets this as Enoch pleasing God. Hebrews goes a step further, adding that this pleasing of God was accomplished precisely by faith. The translation of Enoch, his being taken up into the heavenly realm without experiencing death, is presented not merely as a random cosmic miracle, but as a deliberate reward for a life characterized by a faithful disposition. This deeply moral and religious interpretation strips away the extravagant cosmic speculations found in other ancient Jewish literature, and focuses our attention entirely on Enoch's relational fidelity to the Creator. Now, let us consider the theological axiom the author derives from this historical event. And apart from faith it is impossible to please, for the one approaching God must believe that he exists and that he is the rewarder of those who seek him. This is a profound synthesis of faith as both a relational and cultic approach. Notice how the language seamlessly shifts from pleasing God to approaching God. This spatial language carries deep cultic overtones, reminding us of the high priestly themes explored earlier in Hebrews. However, the approach here is moral rather than purely ritualistic. To draw near to the divine, two epistemological pillars are absolutely mandatory. First, we must believe that God objectively exists, that he is the supreme source of all unseen and seen realities. Second, we must trust his character as a rewarder. For the contemporary community, this is a clarion call. Our ethical endurance is sustained by the absolute conviction that our unseen God is intimately involved in our daily struggles, and will ultimately vindicate and reward those who diligently seek him. Let Enoch's unbroken fellowship with God inspire our own daily walk of faith. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Noah, Reverence, and the Condemnation of the World. Our theological application now focuses on Noah, a figure whose faith bridges the visible and the invisible realms with dramatic consequences. Let us read the account of his extraordinary obedience. By faith, Noah built an ark to save his household, out of reverence, when he was warned about things not yet seen. Here, the author perfectly aligns Noah with the definition of faith established in verse 1. Noah acts decisively on a divine warning concerning an impending global catastrophe that is completely invisible to empirical observation. He constructs an enormous vessel based solely on the unseen word of God. Crucially, the author notes that Noah acted out of reverence, using the Greek word eulabia. This is the exact same theological term used earlier in chapter 5 to describe the reverent submission of Jesus Christ himself during his earthly sufferings. Noah's faith, therefore, is defined by an active, obedient, and holy fear of God. It is not a passive belief, but strenuous, physical effort aimed at saving his household. Now, let us examine the profound dual outcome of Noah's reverential obedience. Through this, he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness that is according to faith. This is where the ethical application for our community becomes intensely sharp. Noah's singular act of faithfulness stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the faithlessness of his generation. By simply obeying God, his daily life became a silent but devastating judgment against the surrounding culture. He did not need to wage a physical war, his righteous obedience was condemnation enough for the corrupt world. Consequently, he inherited the righteousness that flows from faith, linking him directly to the overarching theme of the divine promises. For us today, the lesson is overwhelmingly clear. When we live out our faith with genuine reverence, building our communal lives according to God's unseen word, our very existence serves as a prophetic critique of the worldly systems around us. We are called to be heirs of this same righteousness, remaining steadfast in our ethical commitments, even when society entirely dismisses the invisible realities we deeply revere. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Abraham's Pilgrimage and the Unseen City. We now transition to the great patriarch Abraham, whose life serves as the ultimate paradigm for the community's journey of faith. Let us reflect on the initial call that set his nomadic life in motion. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by departing to a place that he would receive as an inheritance, and he departed without knowing where he was going. The language of calling and obeying immediately connects Abraham's experience to the high priestly calling of Jesus, and to our own calling as believers. Abraham's obedience is absolute and terrifying. He leaves the comfort and security of his known world, stepping out into the void, completely blind to his geographical destination. His journey is the absolute epitome of faith as the proof of things not seen. He acts on the promise of an inheritance that is entirely future and invisible, turning his back on empirical certainty to embrace divine assurance. This is the very heart of the pilgrim identity. Now, let us look at the theological motivation behind this radical nomadic existence. For he was expecting the city that has foundations, whose designer and maker is God. While Abraham technically arrived in the land of Canaan, he lived there in fragile tents as a sojourner. Why? Because his true destination was never merely a piece of Middle Eastern geography. He was looking far beyond the physical land to a permanent, unshakable city intricately designed and built by the Creator himself. This introduces a breathtaking metaphor into the rhetoric of Hebrews. The goal of the ancient patriarchs is identical to the goal of the Christian community, which is the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. As we apply this to our communal life, we must ask ourselves, where is our ultimate citizenship? Like Abraham, we are called to view our present earthly existence as a temporary pilgrimage. We must fiercely resist the temptation to build permanent, worldly empires or to find our ultimate security in material possessions. Instead, our ethical living should be fueled by the joyful expectation of that divine city, allowing the hope of our future heavenly residence to dictate how we live, love, and endure today. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Sarah's Faith and the Faithful Promiser. As we delve deeper into the patriarchal narratives, we must highlight the indispensable role of Sarah, emphasizing that faith is not bound by human limitations. Let us consider the miraculous account of her conception. By faith, even Sarah herself, being sterile, received a capacity for the planting of a seed, even though she was past the age. While some ancient medical and grammatical debates have complicated the translation of this passage, Luke Timothy Johnson persuasively argues that we must read Sarah as the active subject of faith here. The text paints a picture of absolute biological impossibility. Sarah is not only sterile, but she and Abraham are well past the natural age for childbearing. Their physical bodies are described later in the text as being as good as dead. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming empirical evidence of barrenness, Sarah receives supernatural power to conceive. This is a profound testament to the fact that divine life frequently springs forth precisely where human capacity has entirely ceased. Now, let us uncover the core reason for this miraculous empowerment. Because she considered the one who had made the promise to be faithful. Sarah's faith was not a vague, wishful optimism. It was intensely focused on the character of God. She reckoned, or carefully considered, that the promiser was absolutely trustworthy. Her faith anchored itself in the unshakable fidelity of the divine nature. This directly echoes the author's earlier exhortation to the community to hold fast to their confession, for he who promised is faithful. For our application today, Sarah stands as a brilliant beacon of hope when we face dead ends in our communal or personal lives. When our resources are completely exhausted, when our strategies fail, and when the surrounding culture deems our cause sterile and hopeless, we are called to emulate Sarah's rigorous trust. We must look past our circumstantial deadness and fix our eyes firmly on the character of the faithful promiser, knowing that the unseen God specializes in bringing abundant life and impossible fruitfulness out of the most desolate situations. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, the Patriarchal Confession of Alien Status. We arrive now at a crucial synthesis of the patriarchal era, an overarching summary that vividly defines the posture of the faithful community in the world. Let us listen to their collective, historical testimony. These all died according to faith. They did not receive the promises. But seeing from a distance, they both greeted them and confessed that they were strangers and aliens on the land. This is a stunning, paradigm-shifting paradox. The patriarchs lived their entire lives fueled by God's promises, yet they died without ever seeing the full material realization of those promises. However, this lack of immediate fulfillment did not destroy their faith, it brilliantly clarified it. They perceived the ultimate fulfillment from afar, greeting it with eschatological joy. Furthermore, they made a public, highly political confession that they were merely strangers and resident aliens, parapedimos, in the very land they were promised. They consciously rejected the status of worldly citizenship, refusing to integrate fully into the surrounding earthly structures. Now, let us examine the profound divine response to this radical earthly detachment. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly, one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. The patriarchs could have easily returned to their ancestral homeland in Mesopotamia if they merely wanted earthly security and comfort. Instead, they stretched forward, desiring a superior, heavenly reality. Because they aligned their deepest desires with God's heavenly economy rather than earthly kingdoms, God responds with immense honor. In the honor and shame culture of the ancient world, saying God is not ashamed is a powerful understatement, meaning God is fiercely proud to be associated with them. This is the ultimate ethical application for us. Our community must boldly embrace its alien status. We are not meant to perfectly blend into the political or cultural systems of this present age. By living as resident aliens who ardently desire the heavenly homeland, we bring profound honor to God, proving that our faith is rooted in the eternal rather than the ephemeral. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, the Akedah and the Paradigm of Resurrection. In this segment, we confront the most agonizing and profound test of faith in the patriarchal history, the binding of Isaac. Let us hear the text describing this unimaginable divine command. By faith, when Abraham was tested, he sacrificed Isaac, and the one who had received the promises began to offer up his only son. The author does not shy away from the horrific tension of this moment. Abraham is asked to surrender the very child through whom God had explicitly stated the promises would be fulfilled. This is not just the sacrifice of a beloved son, it is the apparent execution of God's own covenant. Yet, Abraham proceeds by faith. He obeys without hesitation, actively initiating the sacrifice. This moment teaches the community that true faith often requires the total relinquishment of our most treasured blessings back to the God who gave them, demonstrating that our ultimate allegiance is to the giver, not merely the gift. Now, let us explore the extraordinary theological rationale that empowered Abraham's obedience. He considered that God was powerful enough even to raise the dead. So also, in symbolic fashion, he received him back. Abraham's faith was intensely logical. He reasoned that if God had supernaturally brought Isaac from a dead womb, God was entirely capable of raising him from literal ashes. This brings the concept of resurrection squarely into the absolute center of the faith narrative. When Abraham received Isaac back alive, the author calls it a parable, a symbolic foreshadowing of the ultimate resurrection of Jesus Christ. For the community facing severe persecution and the imminent threat of martyrdom, this is the definitive application. We can endure the loss of property, status, and even our very lives, because our faith is fundamentally anchored in the God of resurrection. The Akedah proves that no sacrifice made in obedience to God is ever truly lost, for He holds the sovereign power to bring life out of death. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Patriarchal Blessings and Eschatological Memory. As we observe the closing moments of the patriarchal lives, we see how faith completely redefines the experience of death, turning it into an act of forward-looking prophecy. Let us consider the final acts of Isaac and Jacob. By faith also, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come. By faith, Jacob blessed each of the sons of Joseph as he was dying, and bowed over the head of his staff. What is absolutely striking here is that these men are on their deathbeds, their physical strength entirely depleted. Yet, their spiritual vision is razor-sharp. Their faith is not directed backward in nostalgia, but entirely forward toward the eschatological future. They pronounce blessings that meticulously map out the unseen destiny of their descendants. Jacob's act of bowing over his staff is highlighted as a posture of profound worship and unwavering trust at the very edge of mortality. Death, for the believer, is not a defeat, but a final opportunity to testify to the enduring promises of God. Now, let us turn to the remarkable final decree of Joseph. By faith, as he was coming to an end, Joseph remembered the exodus of the children of Israel and gave commands concerning his bones. Joseph lived his life at the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian power, wealth, and luxury. Yet, as he approached death, his heart was not in Egypt. He remembered the future exodus. It is a beautiful, striking paradox. He remembered an event that had not yet happened, simply because God had promised it. His command to have his bones carried out of Egypt centuries later was his ultimate statement of allegiance to the unseen promise over the visible empire. This provides an incredibly powerful application for our community. Our memory must be fundamentally eschatological. We must remember the future God has promised, allowing that future to dictate our present actions and our final testaments. True faith ensures that our ultimate loyalties and our enduring legacy remain bound to the unfolding redemptive narrative of the invisible God. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Moses and the Reproach of the Messiah. We now shift our focus to the monumental figure of Moses, examining how faith inevitably collides with worldly power and demands radical re-identification. Let us read about the audacious beginnings of his life. By faith, when Moses was born he was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they did not fear the king's decree. The narrative of Moses begins with civil disobedience rooted firmly in faith. His parents explicitly defy the murderous edict of the Egyptian pharaoh because they perceive a divine beauty and purpose in their child. Their faith directly conquers the paralyzing fear of imperial tyranny. This establishes a crucial ethical baseline for the community. Authentic faith will always prioritize reverence for God over submission to unjust human authorities. Now, let us examine the deliberate, agonizing choice Moses himself had to make as an adult. He chose rather to suffer hardship with God's people than to have the temporary advantage from sin. He considered the reproach of the Messiah as greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. This is one of the most astonishing theological transpositions in the entire letter. The author asserts that Moses, living centuries before the historical incarnation, consciously embraced the reproach of the Messiah. He voluntarily walked away from the absolute zenith of global wealth, power, and prestige in Pharaoh's court. Why? Because faith completely recalculates value. Moses recognized that the glittering treasures of Egypt were fundamentally intertwined with sin and were ultimately temporary. Conversely, suffering alongside the marginalized, enslaved people of God possessed an eternal, surpassing worth. He looked past the immediate suffering to the unseen divine reward. This is the supreme ethical challenge for our community today. We are called to radically calculate our allegiances. We must be willing to reject the comfortable, advantageous compromises offered by secular society, and deliberately choose the path of hardship and marginalization, identifying proudly with the reproach of Christ, knowing that our unseen reward is infinitely greater. Part 3, Conclusion and Application, Collective Faith and Enduring as Seeing the Invisible God. Welcome to our final slide for this seminar. We conclude our profound study by examining the climax of the narrative, focusing on Moses and the broader Israelite community. Let us hear the text regarding the great Exodus. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's wrath, for he endured as though seeing the one who is invisible. This magnificent statement captures the ultimate ethical application for the believing community. Leaving Egypt was not merely a geographical relocation, it was a profound political and spiritual defiance. Moses deliberately chose not to fear the wrath of the earthly king, Pharaoh, because his vision was entirely fixed on a higher authority. He endured the immense pressure and danger of the Exodus because he lived as though he could physically see the invisible God. This is the very definition of faith as the proof of things not seen, which we established at the beginning of our session. For a community facing contemporary marginalization, the application is incredibly direct and challenging. We are called to stand firm against unjust imperial or societal decrees, drawing our courage from our unwavering focus on the unseen Creator. Now, let us reflect on the broader collective faith mentioned in the text summary. His parents act by faith, and so do those Israelites who cross the Red Sea and circle the walls of Jericho. And it is by faith that Rahab the harlot received the Israelite scouts in peace. The author masterfully expands the lens from the individual leader to the entire community, and even to outsiders like Rahab. Crossing the Red Sea and marching around Jericho were acts that seemed utterly foolish to the empirical world, yet they were powerful demonstrations of collective faith. Rahab's radical hospitality, taking in the scouts in peace amidst the severe threat of destruction, shows that faith inevitably leads to concrete ethical actions of love and solidarity. As we conclude this seminar on faithful living in community, let these ancient heroes be our template. Our faith is our substance, our proof, and our endurance. By seeing the invisible, we are empowered to live faithfully, resist the fleeting treasures of sin, embrace our alien status in this world, and look forward to the heavenly city prepared for us by God Himself.